You know, my very first video on this channel was about how the Fallout fans broke down into some specific groups, such as classic fans and modern fans, and how those groups viewed each other and the franchise. Since then, I've been exposed to numerous interpretations on the fandom at large, and I think it's about time I revisited that topic. I suppose one of the benefits of running a channel that has a bit of a focus on a specific franchise is seeing a lot of different opinions about said franchise. That's certainly true for me in Fallout. My first video, Why Do Fallout Fans Hate Each Other, was a bit of a victim of not really having the channel to pull these opinions from. I of course had no one commenting back then, and really had my own anecdotal to pull from, which is a bit of an issue because my own experiences are not all encompassing. No one's truly is. I'll lump 3 in New Vegas as one and the same, as they both share the love for at least one of the Gamebryo titles, and were likely brought into the franchise by one of those 2 games. My perspective at the time was, as the gameplays were extremely similar, there would be a significant amount of overlap. Truth be told, it's a lot more complicated than that. Between a variety of comments, interactions with my own Discord server, and a survey done in an attempt to gather more actual data, I feel like doing this video as a bit of a correction. That said, I'm not going to pretend that this one is necessarily accurate either. Bias is a concern. Bias in the survey, bias in the Fallout YouTube space, bias in my own personal headspace, and most importantly, the potential differences between the casual players and the hardcore fandom as well. It could be my perspective is simply warped by the groups I spoke with, and categorizing intellectual property I do not own, as well as fans of such intellectual property, is admittedly perhaps a bit of a fool's errand. However, I will still do so out of neatness and honestly just finding it a bit enjoyable. So, let's begin. I'm categorizing the games first. With the games, I'm still keeping the old format but adding one new addition. I'll explain my reasoning in a moment. The games are categorized as follows. Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 are classic. Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas are post-classic. Fallout 4 and 76 are modern, and, this is the new one, Fallout Tactics, Brotherhood of Steel, and Shelter are spin-off. Now, here's my reasoning. I chose to break down the series based on general gameplay style to keep things rather simple. It works well due to each section having 2 games that share extremely similar gameplay, often due to using the same engine. Some may argue that it would be better to divide the game based on timeline rather than gameplay style, putting Shelter in the modern section and Tactics and Brotherhood still as classic. However, while I do see the point, people generally don't think Brotherhood still when they think of classic Fallout. They think of 1 and 2, though some may think as Tactics as well due to it regularly going on a bundle sale with those 2 games. And it does, at least at first glance, have a very similar aesthetic in its design. Nevertheless, when someone says classic style Fallout game, most would typically look at the CRPG mechanics. Of course, you could also argue that New Vegas and Fallout 76 are spin-offs and belong in those categories. New Vegas is a non-numbered game developed by a different company that didn't own the franchise at the time, even if Obsidian is a spiritual successor to Black Isle and featured many of the classic devs, and still does a few today actually. 76 isn't numbered either, at least not in a chronological sense, but the biggest spin-off point is that it's an online title, which does fundamentally change a core aspect of the gameplay, even if it retains the feel of Fallout 4 in much of its functionality. Still, I feel that looking at how the basic gameplay function is the best way to go about it, rather than timeline or chronological numerical systems. It does allow for some wiggle room too. This is hypothetical, but let's say that in Exile, the current owners of Wasteland and the creators of Wasteland 2 and 3 were given the opportunity to create a classic style game, molded in a similar vein of the new Wasteland games, and called it, as a totally made up name, Fallout Throwback. Where would you put that? You could go to spin-off route, of course, but it does hold a style gameplay that is familiar with the main titles of the past. And if it got a sequel, it gets even dicier. You could create a new category, perhaps a neoclassic. In this case, neoclassic and modern, or postmodern depending on Fallout 5's gameplay, could exist side by side. Gameplay categorization, rather than dividing it into eras, despite what the name might apply. When I look at prior artistic movements of the past or general clothing of an era, it's often not the dates that I'm focused on, but rather the general styles that link them together, which may grab heavily at my organization system. even if spin-off is something more of an other category. It's extremely arbitrary with perhaps cherry-picked rationality, but I think it's not completely without a basis. Moving on to fandoms, this is where I begin to dismantle the older system. In the past, I said there are three major groups: classic fans, post-classic fans, and modern fans. Ignorance and naivety perhaps, I said that post-classic fans, 3 in New Vegas, generally got along, but it's become quite apparent to me from my interactions with the community thanks to this channel that such perceptions doesn't really apply. There's hostility between the New Vegas fans and fans of 3, 4, and 76. As such, I think a lot of people would wrap it up as Bethesda fans and Obsidian/Black Isle fans, but I don't think that applies either. Mostly because while writing in New Vegas may be similar in some aspects to classic titles, most New Vegas players haven't really played through the classic titles, and that's also true for fans of Bethesda titles. Now, a lot of classic players have played New Vegas and generally really enjoy it, but that's not really true the other way around. Simply put, the classic games really exist in their own bubble. Now, more fans have played those games, significantly more than Texas and Brotherhood of Steel, but the player base of the classic titles are low enough to have their own culture. Don't get me wrong though, there are a lot of people who hold Fallout 1 higher than 2, or 2 higher than 1. And when 2 came out, there were a lot of people displeased with the direction it went in. Even today, that's true. However, as Fallout 3 and future titles were released, I feel the classic fans generally huddled up, overlooking the original grievances due to disliking what Fallout 3 had to offer. At this point, I think everything besides the classic titles probably exists in their own individual communities rather than being lumped together. So here's my new chart for Fallout fan opinions on the games. Mind you, when I give this information, I'm speaking in a rather absolutist tone. People do have mixed opinions about nearly everything. This is a generalization in the phrase I identify as blank fan. But you may love Fallout 1 and think Fallout 76 is the best game ever. You could even identify as a Fallout 3 and a Vegas fan. People are complicated, so this chart is more of a blanket covering generalization, not absolute facts. I know that you, Joey, are a Fallout 3 fan and actually enjoy Fallout 1 pretty well, so do not take any of this as gospel or targeted. Classic fans love the original titles, of course. They really dislike 3 and 4, although perhaps they at least respect that 3 tried to have more in the way of RPG mechanics compared to 4, even if they saw it as a failure. They mostly like New Vegas, though they may criticize it for being mechanically similar to Fallout 3. For them, it's a significant step up from 3, but perhaps not on the level of the original games. Could be that they felt that the Gamebryo engine was too limiting. They might not be a fan of the art assets or directions. For some, it's just that they're not a fan of the first-person shooter games. Looking around classic Fallout communities, they largely praise the writing of New Vegas and its atmosphere overall, the deciding factor of how they felt about New Vegas. Of course, 76 is a no-go for the classic fans, being the peak of their dislike, with limited to no RPG mechanics, an online title, and generally distaste for the narrative style of Bethesda. Fallout 3 fans don't care much about the classic games. They largely can't stand the gameplay. They may enjoy the lore, or at least state they do. This is actually true for every single other category, so keep that in mind. They have a complicated relationship with New Vegas though. They don't usually care for the boring desert, preferring the smashed up DC ruins, and may not like Mr. New Vegas as much as they liked Three Dog, but often do enjoy the technical improvements New Vegas has made for the engine and gameplay. And while many may enjoy the overall story of the game and the ability to choose your faction, there are those who feel the writing isn't as good as the narrative of Fallout 3. However, the biggest issue with the game is actually the New Vegas fandom, but I'll talk about that more later. Fallout 4, for many of the fans, is a letdown in terms of the RPG mechanics. While they may enjoy the game overall, particularly the settlement building, shooting and crafting, the voice protagonist often feels rather limiting. Then there's 76, like most others on this list. They're not really a fan of the online multiplayer aspect and generally feel it is a huge step down. Fallout New Vegas fans, despite enjoying the Western lore, often do not care about the classic games. They usually haven't actually played them. They may grasp at some lore bits, read wikis, Reddit posts, or watch videos, but they haven't actually learned from physically playing the game. From a gameplay standpoint, they do enjoy Fallout 3 for the most part, but they often fall pretty heavily in love with the Western setting that it might crack their views on Eastern setting titles. Like 3 fans, however, they find many of the same issues with Fallout 4, lack of RPG mechanics. They especially feel there's a letdown from mechanics of New Vegas, and they dislike 76 rather heavily with the online aspect. Fallout 4 fans dislike the classic games and sometimes have difficulty enjoying 3 in New Vegas due to the jankier gunplay. 4 gets a lot of its strength from many people claiming it had the better combat experience. Fans of 4 may or may not dislike the lesser RPG mechanics, but often feel like the customization of it makes up for that missing detail. Settlement building is a really loved feature for this fanbase. Their opinions on 76 is a bit more interesting. They may dislike it for the online aspect, as does the classic to New Vegas fans. However, 76 shares a lot of the same core gameplay as 4 does, so it's probably a little bit easier for them to enjoy. Still, more dislike it than not. Fallout 76 fans dislike the general gameplay of the classic titles, of course, but like most others, enjoy the lore. And like 4 fans have a harder time with the Gamebryo games for their jankier combat experience. They likely do enjoy 4 pretty well, same general gameplay after all, but do mostly enjoy 76 for its possible new loot, based developments, and community. Still, there are heavy criticisms in the community involving the pace of updates. Moving on to the fandom opinions of each other. Generally speaking, the community as a whole seem to view Classic and New Vegas fans as the most spiteful. A large part of this is due to No Mutants Allowed's reputation as being incredibly hostile, along with New Vegas fans often having strong opinions about 3 and 4. Classic and New Vegas fans are lumped together. But as I said a couple of times, I don't generally support that notion. While they may have similar opinions about 3 to 76, I feel New Vegas fans typically only really like New Vegas and don't care much for the classic games. Classic fans probably dislike most other fans, but generally don't really have this assumed brotherhood with New Vegas fans due to New Vegas fans honestly having ignorance about the classic titles. They may be on okay terms or just indifference. 3 or 4 fans get along fairly well, while disliking New Vegas and classic fans for its claimed toxicity. And 76 fans generally get the blunt end on the stick from pretty much everyone else while being fairly welcoming of everyone. Overall though, I expect the biggest conflicts involve the New Vegas camp. There's a lot of bad blood between New Vegas fans and 3 and 4 fans. These days, perhaps more so with 4 than 3. Since 76 is attacked by everyone, there seems to be an odd union there. I see a lot of people claim that New Vegas fans are incredibly hostile and toxic, always jumping at people's throats. Statements that you can't dare criticize the game without several people attacking you, or you can't praise 3 or 4 without a similar result. Anecdotally, I often find far more claims about this happening than I've actually seen it happening myself. To be clear, I have seen it, and in some cases have seen the reverse happening too. That said, I don't think there's such a thing as an innocent fandom. The word fandom is rooted to the word fanatic, and, well, fanatics are a bit zealous. A fandom by nature is going to have strong opinions and passion about a subject. Arguments are inevitable. As for the classic fans, usually classic fans keep to themselves. While there will be random nerf fights in the YouTube comment section, they generally only gang up on people when they come to their own turf, so to speak. After all, classic fans are very much aware they're in a minority. I feel they recluse out of being exhausted. But I've been wrong before. That's why I made this update, and why I'm probably going to make a new update at some point in the future. After all, the opinions of a game are a bit complicated with such a broken fanbase. Engaging everything is a bit hard to do. I've always intended to make a sequel to the first video with a survey, and this is a follow-up to that survey. Kinda makes this one a remake of the first one while also being a sequel to the sequel. Speaking of surveys, I found the classic bubble to be fairly interesting, so I made a new survey about that. While it's primarily targeted to classic fans, non-classic fans can submit some data too. It's actually valuable to get an insight from both. I want to ask about your opinions on the old games, your opinions about the franchise as a whole, the perception of the classic fandom to the larger audience, and the perception of said larger audience to the classic fandom. Thank you. Have a good one.